Okay, welcome everyone to the Peace Through Strength webinar brought to you by the American Security Council Foundation. I'm your host, Joy Vatrabek. I'm the Director of Operations here. And the American Security Council Foundation, if you're not familiar with, was started in 1958 to combat communism here in the United States. Went on to play a big role in Washington, D.C. with the Coalition of Peace Through Strength. That coalition had over 230 bipartisan support in Congress and over 160 national organizations, including Ronald Reagan among them. And as president, he would go on to thank our organization for our work with the Peace Through Strength strategies. So very proud of our background, and Peace Through Strength is ever so relevant today as we continue to bring public awareness to national security, economic security, and moral leadership. And part of that is U.S. Global Leadership Middle East Part 3, as we'll be discussing today. And I thank you very much, Gregg Roman, Executive Director of the Middle East Forum, for joining us. And a little about Gregg. He is the Executive Director of the Middle East Forum, as I mentioned, previously directing the Community Relations Council of the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh. In 2014, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency named him one of the 10 most inspiring global Jewish leaders. And he previously served as the political advisor to the Deputy Foreign Minister of Israel and worked for the Israeli Ministry of Defense. A frequent speaker on Middle East affairs, Mr. Roman appears on international news channels such as Fox News, I-24 News, Al-Jazeera, BBC World News, and Israel's channels 12 and 13. He studied national security and political communications at American University and the Interdisciplinary Center in, and I might mess this one up, Gregg, but Herzliya, and has contributed to The Hill, Newsweek, the Los Angeles Times, the Miami Herald, and the Jerusalem Post. So we really appreciate you being with us to give us some insight on the Middle East currently. And you can contact Gregg at info@weforum.org, as we're going to post that up on our site. Also, the Middle East Forum is at www.weforum.org. And as I turn this over to Gregg, I know in our webinar we mentioned talking about a lot of different countries surrounding Israel and the role that they may be playing, but a lot has happened in the last 24 hours, as I'm sure many of you are aware. So Gregg, if you would please go ahead and fill us in.
Sure. Joy, thank you very much for the opportunity to address your audience. And also thank you for the opportunity to speak again with the American Security Council Foundation. I believe the last time we had the chance to speak in person was down in Florida almost a year ago.
Yes,
now.
Thank you.
So it's really great to be here, even though, albeit it's in a virtual environment. I'm going to do a few things today for the webinar. The first is I'm going to give you a general overview of what's happened the last 24 hours in the Middle East and how it affects American national security interests. And we'll try to zoom out a little bit and try to get a better understanding of how did we get here? How are we now at a point where there's the potential for a catalytic, kinetic event taking place between Israel, Iran, Gulf Arab allies of the United States, and perhaps even the United States itself. And then we'll talk about policy solutions and where do we go from here. So to give a review of the news. Yesterday, around 1 p.m. local time in Baghdad, there was an order given by the Department of Defense to allow the volunteer evacuation of non-combatants from the U.S. Embassy, from U.S. bases. And that order then extended to Bahrain, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. About 6 hours later, another statement was made through the Secretary of State's office confirming that the same issue took place with U.S. embassies and diplomatic posts in the region. About 2 hours after that, there was a flurry of news reports from CBS News, from the Washington Post, from the New York Times, which all hinted at the possibility that U.S. intelligence estimates had concluded that Israel has prepared and finalized its preparations for the potential of an Israeli strike against Iran's nuclear apparatuses. This was met with a not hallowed response, but a pretty severe response, which came from the Iranian government, saying that if Israel or any individual nation were to strike its nuclear infrastructure or violate its airspace, they could expect a result which would not have been like April of last year when Iran first launched drones and ballistic missiles against Israel, or October of last year where we saw hundreds of ballistic missiles fired from Iranian territory hit Israel, its military bases and civilian areas, but one that Israel has never seen before. They also extended that threat to U.S. military installations in the region, saying that any Israeli attack would be seen as a Western attack against Iran rather than one which was just coming from the Jewish state. Now, today, even more news has come out regarding the Iran nuclear file, with the International Atomic Energy Agency, prompted by European Union countries with backing from the United States, finding that Iran, for the first time in 19 years meeting on this issue, has violated the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. This isn't something that took place during the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, which was known as the Iran nuclear deal that President Trump pulled out of in 2018. Didn't happen in 2003 when Iran was suspected of building a nuclear weapon, even getting to the point where it was testing the fission trigger device, which is needed in order to detonate fissile material. It's the first time in the last 20 years that Iran has been found in violation of the treaty. And what this means practically is that Europe now has an obligation to snap back sanctions on Iran that were lifted in 2015 as part of Obama's and the what's called the P5+1, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council plus Germany, and to snap back those sanctions from the EU and individual European states on Iran. Iran has promised to respond by further enriching uranium almost to a 90% threshold, which is what you need for a modern nuclear device. So, are Israeli jets on the airstrips right now getting ready to take off for Tehran? Is Israel in Iran's missile silos crosshairs getting ready for a responsive attack? Is it possible that Iran will launch a preemptive attack against Israel? And are U.S. military installations ready? The latest news, which just came across the wire about an hour or two ago, was President Trump said, quote, "We are urging Israel to, we're fairly close to a pretty good agreement." And he went on to stress that he does not want to see conflict, not just between America and Iran, but between Israel and Iran. So if you are Prime Minister Netanyahu right now presiding over a security cabinet, which is the smaller cabinet in Israel meeting, making the decision whether you're going to send your jets to go bomb Iran's nuclear infrastructure, what exactly is it that you have at your fingertips that you have to be concerned about? This is where I want to zoom out a little bit. Some of the news that has come across other wires, not just in the last day, but in the last month, shows that Iran is marching on its way to a nuclear weapon. You had a House Armed Services Committee hearing with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, where he concluded that Iran is preparing a nuclear weapon. You had a report come out from the Defense Intelligence Agency at the beginning of May, which determined that Iran, if it made the decision to build a nuclear weapon, would only have to take 1 week to be able to do that. This is the most narrow and shortest time frame that has been assessed by the U.S. government since it started tracking Iran's nuclear program. And you even have independent verification outside the United States and outside Israel with the equivalent of the FBI in Austria, their domestic intelligence agency, but also responsible for overseas threats, concluding in a report in the middle of May that Iran is set and is getting ready to prepare a nuclear weapon. So if we look at the tracks that are going on between diplomacy, military action, what's happening behind the scenes in the world of intelligence and track 2 negotiations, there are at least 3 countries which have determined that Iran is marching towards building or preparing what's needed to construct a nuclear weapon. Nothing's been talking about a detonation test yet, but there's the determination by the U.S. and Israel and Austria in this case. And even if you want to go so far as to say an international organization where the IAEA today made public a report saying that Iran had a nuclear weapons program, has violated the terms of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action beyond their enrichment that they took after Trump canceled the American participation in the deal in 2018. And you're Prime Minister Netanyahu, knowing all of these things, and this is just what's publicly available. You must have information at your disposal which would cause you to do a few things. The first, if you decide to strike, you're directly opposing a request from the President of the United States. Second, maybe there's a political calculus in this in terms of deciding that you have a narrow window of opportunity to go forward to strike before the Sunday meeting, which is set to take place between the Iranian Foreign Minister and U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, which is scheduled to take place, the sixth round of nuclear talks between the United States and Iran in Muscat, Oman, this Sunday. The third thing that you have to take into consideration is perhaps you have information available at your fingertips, which is more comprehensive than what's publicly available. And you have a source inside Iran which says, you know what? The negotiations are only being used as cover to allow the nuclear program to march to the point where they have a device that they can detonate. And I think the next 72 hours is going to be decisive, not just for the future of the Israel-Iran conflict, but that might change the face of the Middle East as we know it. Now, Joy, I can stop there just on the issue and answer questions, or I can go into the larger presentation that I was hoping to give. What would you like?
If we have questions, please put them in the chat box area. Tracy Steele, our outreach coordinator, is going to be reading them off to you, Greg. Tracy, do you have any questions as of this moment?
No, not yet, Joy. Thank you.
So I can go into the wider region in terms of other things that are going on beyond the nuclear file. So while that's the headline news, there are many other stories that are important to follow and as they impact Israel's relationship with the United States and also other countries in the region. On Tuesday, there was a hearing that took place at the U.S. House of Representatives Lantos Commission on Human Rights, which focused on Turkey and the deteriorating condition of minorities there, and also for the ability for democratic society to thrive. In the last 6 months, we have seen the mayor of Istanbul, Imamoglu, put in jail on trumped-up terrorism charges. He was the main leader expected to run against Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, in the upcoming Turkish presidential elections. We see there is a gradual deterioration of Orthodox and other Christian priests who are active inside Turkey, slowly fleeing because Christian institutions are coming under attack. We see that Kurdish politicians have been rounded up and thrown in jail, including the 31 Kurdish majority municipalities in the east of the country. Every mayor of every Kurdish town over the last 5 years in Turkey is now sitting in jail, along with the head of the Kurdish political party, the HDP, Saladin Demirtas. So Erdogan has tried to wipe out Kurdish political opposition to him in the country. And even, as I said beforehand at the introduction of my Turkish remarks, Imamoglu, the head of the CHP, the main opposition party to Erdogan's party, the AKP, is now sitting in jail. And just last week, there were even more raids on CHP offices for alleged corruption and terrorism. But all of this was on display at the House of Representatives. And right now, there's a case to be made that Turkey is in violation of U.S. law insofar as it relates to its defense relationship with Washington. About 4 years ago, right at the end of the Trump administration, 4.5 years ago, at the end of the first Trump administration, there was a law that was put into place called CAATSA, which prevents American allies that seek to procure advanced American weaponry. Think of the F-35, think of the Patriot anti-missile system, think of U.S. ships or other technology that it uses. If they were in possession of a Russian or Chinese defense system. So in 2018-2019, Turkey obtained the S-400 anti-air missile system, which triggered an American law which said that Turkey could no longer participate in the F-35 program. Since that time, Turkey has been trying to obtain 2 sets of weapons which it could use to imbalance the region. The first is the F-16T advanced fighter jet program, basically the F-16, but modified for Turkish needs. And it's been trying to get its way back into the F-35 program. Now, this year, as part of the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, you're going to see Turkey and its lobbyists and its friends on the Hill trying to re-participate or rejoin its participation in the F-35 program. What this would mean is that America's second most advanced fighter jet, if given to Turkey, would be flying over the same skies that were being defended by an S-400 system, meaning that any American technology or superiority that we have over Russian surface-to-air missiles would be able to be tested by Russia's operators that were training Turks to use the S-400, thereby taking the data from the F-35 and the data from the S-400 and trying to find ways to manipulate it so that the Russians would be able to figure out how the F-35 works. This would immediately threaten U.S. air superiority vis-a-vis Russia. And it's something that Erdogan is trying to get around by saying that he'll give the S-400 to someone else, maybe to Syria, which is basically now a Turkish statelet in the region. And it's something that we have to be particularly concerned about. I'll do two more points before I get to the written questions. The second is, what's the future of Jelani in Syria now that the U.S. has lifted sanctions against the Syrian government? So we see a man who 15 years ago was sitting in an American prison in Iraq for having participated as a member of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, trying to kill American troops, leave the Iraqi prison, ordered by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the former head of ISIS, to go to Syria to set up ISIS in Syria. He sort of chomps at the bit and takes the opportunity that al-Baghdadi gives to him to start his own group in Syria, fights as a Syrian rebel, a U.S. designated terrorist for 13 years, and then somehow finds himself in December of 2024 leading the charge on Damascus, seeing the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad, and now 6 months later, he is the internationally recognized head of state of the Syrian government. There's no longer any American sanctions, or Syria being designated as a state sponsor of terrorism is slowly going in the direction of being taken off the list. And we see him trying to consolidate control in Damascus. But the problem is that Jelani himself only has about 55,000 fighters under arms under his direct control in the country. There's an additional 60,000 Turkish-backed non-Syrian foreign jihadis who are also ostensibly under his rule, trying to be integrated into the Syrian army. And you also have another 100,000 Kurdish fighters, which are being backed by the United States and in the northeast of the country, an additional couple tens of thousands of Druze in the south of the country, and of course, the Alawi minority that inhabits the Syrian coastline between Tartus, Latakia, and Khamamim. And this is a recipe, if Jelani is not able to get all these disparate factions to work together, for disaster, which is why, at this point, Israel is now occupying more land than it had during its withdrawal from the Golan Heights in 1973. And also you see the rise of relations between the Druze in Syria and Israel, the Kurds in the northeast of the country and Israel, and you even have Alawi minority groups in the Syrian diaspora asking for Israel to provide protection from foreign jihadis in the coastal regions of the country. So two significant things happened in the Syrian-Israel context, which is good for the United States. The first is the government of Azerbaijan has been leading negotiations between Syria and Jelani's foreign minister and military delegations from Israel's general staff to try to figure out how exactly security in southern Syria can lead to a position for the Syrian army to reconstitute its access to that area while protecting the Druze, and also so that Israel can have its security concerns met to make sure that Iran and its proxies don't use southern Syria as a launch pad for missile attacks against Israel. In fact, just last week, there was missiles fired from the Syrian side of the Golan Heights into Israel. And just last night, there was an Israeli operation in southern Syria to arrest members of Hamas who were planning an attack on the Israeli residential areas of the Golan Heights. The second issue that I'll tackle is Lebanon. Hezbollah has been effectively fragmented and destroyed and no longer has any control over its former bases in South Lebanon, south of the Litani River, which is sort of the natural boundary that demarcates South Lebanon from the center of the country on your way to Beirut. The Lebanese army has now deployed to every former Hezbollah base. The Lebanese army is even acting on Israeli intelligence, trying to intercept and uncover Hezbollah weapon stores that are all throughout Beirut. So Hezbollah has been effectively removed as a viable fighting party against Israel and as a significant political force in Lebanon under the new government of the new president and the new prime minister. To be able to keep this, though, the line which was used to fund, to arm, and to train Hezbollah coming from Iran across the Iraq into Syria and then into Lebanon has to continue to be interrupted. But in this case, it's actually not Israel who's doing most of the interceptions of that weaponry. It's the Lebanese government. It's the new Syrian government. Iraq is still a playground for Hezbollah, Iran, and its proxies. But if the momentum continues in the way in which it's going, Israel has the ability to not necessarily ask Lebanon and Syria to be a guarantor of its security in Israel's north, but to cooperate with them rather than to be at odds with them. So there's plenty of other things we can talk about. The Houthis, Iraq, what's going on with the Gulf states. Qatar is something that I think we might want to touch on. But Joy, I'll answer some of these questions first.
So we've got about 3 questions. So in light of your time and everyone's time here, Tracy, first question, please.
Yes, thank you. This is from Dr. Hiltz. What do you expect to be the next move should Israel strike Iran? Will China and Russia jump in to support Iran?
So we actually had a war game about a potential Israeli strike against Iran and the wider nuclear issue that some of the folks on this call participated in back, I'd say about 2 weeks ago. And one of the things that happened as a scenario with an Israeli strike against Iran, and the U.S. preparing its own strike, was that the Chinese sent a naval flotilla through the Strait of Hormuz to protect Iranian oil refineries and oil shipping capabilities, because now China is very much dependent on Iranian oil for its economy, getting it at a discount rate. There wasn't that much Russian involvement in the war game, but there was the possibility for Russia to take advantage of a Middle East conflict to press further in Ukraine and other areas. My own take is that Russia does not seek to get militarily involved in any Middle East conflagration. It's currently trying to hold on to its bases in Syria. It has a pretty good relationship with the Israeli prime minister. Not saying that it's to Israel's benefit, but it's one in which there's an open line of communication. And China right now, I think, would maybe take U.S. involvement in a conflict with Iran to potentially use it as the opportunity to do something with Taiwan. So I don't foresee any Chinese or Russian involvement directly with Iran providing air cover, providing an increase in weaponry supplies more than it does right now. But I think that if Iran was really to go the way of striking back against Israel, the Chinese and the Russians would first call for diplomacy. And if it ended up being an extended conflict, you might see China or Russia resupply Iran, as much as Iran has been responsible for supplying Russia with the Shahed 136 drones that they've been using over Ukraine. But right now, Russia does not have the capacity to provide that much armaments to the Iranians. And I don't think that you really have a Chinese appetite to get involved in a Middle East conflict.
Good points. Next question, Tracy.
Yes, this one, Rabbi Daniel Zucker actually posed the question. And if I'm going to unmute you, Rabbi, and just let you ask that, because I want to make sure I'm not misinterpreting your question.
Yeah, I can get that. It's have you taken into account this week's report from the MEK, National Council for Resistance in Iran, Reza Jafarzadeh, of a much larger secret nuclear program taking place in the Iranian desert? I'm going to answer the question with a question, good Talmudic style, which is, what do we know? What we know about Iran's nuclear program is apparent, but it's what we don't know that really concerns me. In that report that came out from the IAEA today, there was 4 previously unreported Iranian nuclear sites, which could be places that they might detonate a weapon. There was 4 locations that I, at least in my review of the literature, and I've been doing this for 20 years, have never heard of. So I think that beyond Fordo, which is where they have an enrichment facility, Qom, which is where they have an enrichment facility, Isfahan and Natanz, there might be an entire parallel program the IRGC's military elements of the program that were supposed to have been suspended in 2003 that they may have been carrying out in the desert. Now, through a combination of signal intelligence, which means monitoring what the Iranians are saying on their networks, human intelligence, which is having sources, human sources in Iran's nuclear program and in the rest of the state, anything dealing with open source intelligence, which may be chatter on social media, or even what's been available from intelligence taken by Israeli and American spy satellites. I would be remiss to say that even though we may not have heard about it publicly, there's probably a private element, which NCRI did report on last week, that we have to be very aware of. And I think that probably one of those calculations that I was mentioning earlier that Prime Minister Netanyahu was taking into consideration is the extent of the Iranian nuclear program, which is known to Israeli policymakers and to American policymakers, at the point where there might be other parallel programs, other programs which are more advanced in terms of the weaponization of Iran's nuclear and fissile material that now have been discovered, and that might be the casus belli for causing a decision to be made in Jerusalem to launch a strike against Iran. So I think, Rabbi, you also have to look historically at what happens when Israel finds out about its adversaries' nuclear programs. In the 80s, with Operation Opera, there was the decision by Israel to take out the Osiris nuclear reactor that Saddam Hussein was building with French support. And that led to international condemnation against Israel, American sanctions against Israel, European sanctions against Israel. But a few years later, after the Gulf War, it ended up being the same people who condemned Israel for taking out the Iraqi nuclear program saying thank you. It was Dick Cheney's famous quote. And 26 years later, with Operation Orchard over Syrian airspace in Deir al-Zor, where Assad was building a plutonium reactor with the assistance of North Korea, and Israel, much like Operation Opera, decided to take out the Syrian nuclear program. There was a little bit of hesitation on the side of President Bush when Prime Minister Olmert told him about it almost after the fact. Now we are 18 years later. I think Iraq at that point was not necessarily capable of causing significant damage beyond asymmetrical and proxy attacks against Israel through support of Palestinian terror. There wasn't much of a response by Assad for Israel basically surprising the world and taking out the reactor in Deir al-Zor. But it's a whole different animal with the Iranian program. You have hundreds of sites which would have to be struck to be able to completely eliminate Iran's ability not just to refine uranium, but to mine it, to be able to assemble devices. The Iranians were very smart. They monitored what happened in Iraq and they monitored what happened in Syria. They have their programs spread out and redundancies built in, as I said beforehand, in hundreds of locations across the country. One estimate by a former head of air power for Central Command, who's now retired, said that it will take up to 1,500 sorties, that's 1,500 individual air missions, to be able to set back Iran's nuclear program only by 18 months. And I just don't know if the Israelis have the air power, the weaponry, and the armaments to go it alone, nor I'm not sure if they have the stomach to see what happens if an Israeli pilot flying over the skies of Iran gets shot down and to see what happens to him. So there's a lot of points of calculus that the prime minister and the security cabinet and the Israeli security organs have to take into account to actually get them to the point where they're saying, okay, let the jets fly. So the MEK report is one indicator of what is the known unknowns, right? But what about the unknown unknowns? So I hope I answered that.
Well, thank you, Greg. We are right at 2:30. Was there any other questions, Tracy?
No, there are no other questions in the chat.
Okay, well, Greg, it was very much an honor for you to come on as our special guest today. We appreciate that. And to our, are you there, Greg?
Yeah.
Okay, we blacked off my screen for a minute. I appreciate you coming on today. Good to have you. You are a wealth of information, and there is quite a bit going on in the Middle East landscape these days, so stay tuned. Again, he's at the Middle East Forum, meforum.org. And to learn more about the American Security Council Foundation, please go to www.ascf.us. You can join our newsletter, and we will send out articles and podcasts, as well as upcoming webinars. We are going to take a break from our webinars next month for the summer. We'll be back on August 14th at 2 p.m. and should be discussing the U.S. trade deal and rare earth minerals. So please join us then. Thank you again, Greg, and thank you to everyone that joined us today.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day. Thank you.